We're getting you ready for next week's scouting combine in Indianapolis. Special guest Joe DeLeone joins me for the first time on the LockedOn Giants podcast to break down the Giants' needs, to talk about the strengths of the upcoming draft class and the potential fits for the Giants as they begin a critical offseason under first-time general manager Joe Schoen. That's coming up next on the LockedOn Giants podcast. Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to a new edition of the LockedOn Giants podcast, part of the LockedOn podcast family, your team every day. My name is Patricia Drana. Happy to have you with us, and as promised, we are going to be doing a combine preview show, and I have with me Joe DeLeone. He is a producer over for the BLEAV podcast network. He is also the host of the NFL Draft Prospects podcast for BLEAV. And Joe, first off, thank you so much for coming on with me.
Thank you for having me. I've been doing a lot of combine talk and the week's ramping up, but I'm just excited to talk about the Giants. When I saw that this popped up, I was like, oh, let's go. I get to talk about my hometown team.
Absolutely. We will talk about that. And before we jump in, let me just before I forget, I have to thank everybody for making the Locked On Giants podcast your first listen of the day, or if you're watching on YouTube, your first watch of the day. So, Joe, we've got a lot to talk about. This is a very critical offseason for the Giants. Joe Schoen's first offseason as general manager. A lot of decisions to be made, a lot of different directions they can go in. If you're trying to make sense of all this, what are some of the things where you see a crossroad for Joe Schoen? In other words, draft or free agency. Should I cut this guy? Should I trade this guy? What are some of the crossovers or the crossroads rather that you see that can potentially make or break this first season?
Right. I think the big major priority for Schoen that we're seeing for the Giants is that he does need to remove a lot of these older players that are on expensive contracts. And it might be guys that fans are, really, really like James Bradbury might be somebody that they have to move on from because of the current cap situation. So there's probably going to be a lot of familiar faces, Logan Ryan, someone like that, that's going to get kicked to the curb because they can't afford to keep everybody under the current cap situation. Dave Gettleman dug them such a big hole that's the first priority right now. And if you're doing all of that and you're trying to remove all these expensive veterans, the next best route has to be building in the draft. And luckily they have a number of high draft choices, especially early in the top 10, that they can start doing that in this year's class. I mean, it's a perfect situation for Schoen in terms of the draft to do that. But if you want to rework this current cap situation, it's going to be starting to get young and cheap and move on from those expensive deals that might not be playing out the way that we had hoped.
Now, you mentioned the draft, so let me backtrack a little bit here. Where do you see the strength of this year's draft class? Because, last year, obviously, there wasn't a whole lot of talent because of COVID and the effect that it had on some of the college programs. The anticipation was this year that some of the positions that were weak last year would be stronger this year. Where are the top strengths in this year's draft class?
It's a very strong defensive class, particularly the edge group is very, very talented. You've got the guys at the top that are vying for that first overall selection, Aiden Hutchinson and Kayvon Thibodeau, Hutchinson from Michigan, Thibodeau from Oregon. But then you also have players like George Karlaftis from Purdue. You've got Myjai Sanders from Cincinnati, Jermaine Johnson from Florida State. There are a lot of guys that I think are going to go in the first round that are going to be high impact edge rushers. But the big thing for the edge group is that there are a lot of names that later on in day 2 and day 3 that could be rotational pieces for a team that wants to build out a strong group of pass rushers. And we know that Wink Martindale kind of likes to have as many different faces to work in. He's necessarily hasn't drafted like a big top 10 edge rusher. And he's been able to turn guys that are day 2, late day 1 picks into really quality pass rushers. But this is a really, really good edge class. There's some really talented corners like Derek Stingley and Andrew Booth, some quality safeties as well. But this is the year that if the Giants want to completely rework that defense and get young, it is going to be the perfect year for them to do that.
But of course, as far as the Giants are concerned, everybody's like offensive line, offensive line, offensive line. Now, here's the thing with offensive line. There are some good players that are first round worthy, but are there players that are worthy of going number 5, going number 7? That seems to be where there's a debate. Where do you weigh in on that?
I think that Evan Neal is certainly worthy of going at that 5 spot. The thing that's really odd right now, you kind of see Evan Neal being in the mix for that first overall pick, but the guy's a great athlete. He's a fantastic athlete. He's massive. You kind of hear these Mekhi Becton comparisons because of how big and explosive he is. But I mean, I would argue that Penei Sewell last year was a much better prospect, and he went later than that first overall selection, albeit there were a lot more quality quarterbacks. But Sewell ended up going later to the Lions. So Evan Neal, if he ends up there at 5, I think that's a great selection. That's a great opportunity to find someone to play opposite of Andrew Thomas. I think Ika Mekwonu from NC State is also worthy of that conversation. And then it might be a little bit too rich, but Kenyon Green, who's an interior offensive lineman from Texas A&M, he did play a little tackle this year. He's a really, really strong player. And at the beginning of the college football season, he was somebody who was brought up as maybe a top 10 pick. His name is kind of slowed down a little bit, but I still think that Kenyon Green is a really quality guard. And then if the Giants want to spend a high draft choice, maybe that second first rounder on him, I wouldn't be disappointed if they did that.
But is it worth it? Do you get good value if you're spending a 5 or a 7 on a guard or a center? I mean, usually a tackle, yeah, but
right.
Usually you want to go a little lower for a guard or a center.
Right. That's the tricky part that we get into here. And the few guys that have been worthy of that selection, like Brandon Scherf or Quentin Nelson, they were astronomically better than any of the other offensive linemen. So that's where things get a little bit tricky. And I think that because of how good this defensive class is at the top, it's going to overshadow that want to draft 2 offensive linemen, or maybe reach if, like, say, Ekwonu or Neal, both of those guys were gone. If they wanted to go and grab Green, it might be a little bit of a reach. And if maybe they wanted to trade back with that second pick, that 7 might be a little bit too rich for going for a guard, because as good as Green is, and as much as I like Kenyon Green, he's not a Quentin Nelson. He's not a Brandon Scherf.
You know, we've been talking about some offensive tackles. What about Charles Cross? That's a name that keeps popping up that people seem to like.
Yeah, Charles Cross is in the mix there as well. And I think that he's probably more mid first round if he's going to be selected. So still in line with that, maybe the Giants benefit from, like they did last year, somebody wants to trade up for a quarterback. Maybe they end up with that opportunity to draft Cross somewhere in those teen picks. But I think Cross is probably in that second tier of quality offensive linemen in this class. But still a quality player, just might be a little bit outside that range to be picked in the top 10.
All right, now let's talk about the possibility of trading down, because usually if you're going to trade down, that's because somebody wants to trade up to get a quarterback. But this year's quarterback class is not brimming with surefire hits, I guess. So how much does that kind of complicate this whole idea of teams that, who might want to trade down? And also I look at, from the Giants' perspective, I look at Carolina as being the key here, because if they need a quarterback, then I could see, a team like Denver or even Washington wanting to leapfrog ahead of them. So, I mean, how much does this quarterback situation kind of muddle the whole thing?
Right. The quarterback group is really not good. And I wouldn't be shocked if we don't even have one that goes in the top 5. But what could potentially happen, because there are some decent quarterback prospects, there's just not really like that high ceiling elite guy. So a team that's desperate to get a quarterback, if we have one guy go in the top 10, that might open up the floodgates for somebody else to trade up, because they don't want to miss out on the next guy. Because the minute that whoever everybody had top on their board, which is probably going to be vastly different than it's been in the past, because of it depends on who these, or what traits these teams value and what they're looking for as a replacement. But you kind of have to hope, if you're the Giants, that somebody does take a quarterback early, and then that opens the floodgates to maybe try and trade up, or maybe they're getting murmurs that somebody else is trying to trade up. Maybe the Giants can play into this well enough and convince somebody like, hey, we're on the phone with the Broncos, like to another team, and say like, hey, do you want to trade up before they do so? So hopefully that happens. It's probably the best chance of if that's going to occur.
All right, Giant fans, we have more coming up on the Locked On Giants podcast. But first, betonline.net is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline.net is also the best spot for all your sports scores, your podcasts, and news, whether it's basketball, hockey, boxing, and UFC. Plus, you can find out all you need to know about your favorite Vegas games. Head on over to their website today on your desktop or your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline.net, where the game starts. We're talking with Joe DeLeone. He is the host of the BLEAV NFL Draft Prospects podcast. He is also a producer over there, really into the NFL draft, and he's also from the local area, so he knows the Giants pretty well. So a really good guest to have on. Joe, I want to talk about the Giants for a little bit here because, we have a new coaching staff, obviously, and a lot of question marks as to what type of players are going to fit into the schemes. Now let's start with the defense. We touched upon it just a tad in the last segment. Let's get into it a little bit more regarding the type of players Wink Martindale potentially needs. Now I look at the Giants defense and I say, okay, they need another defensive lineman, a true nose tackle. They probably could use another inside linebacker. We can agree they need a Batman edge rusher, and they probably could use another cornerback. And say, they can use everything, I guess. So let's just kind of start from the front, the defensive line, and work our way back. What are some of the characteristics at each of those units that you think are going to make Wink's defense hum here?
Right. We see a lot of the strengths that have been with Wink's defenses. He has had really talented defensive tackles. Like you see, Michael Pierce came from Baltimore. Calais Campbell finishing his career there. You would hope that they make an effort to maybe get somebody to bolster that group. But I look at the current group that they have right now. I think Leonard Williams and Dexter Lawrence are already a strong pairing in the interior, and the ability that they've had to create pressure. I think the bigger emphasis is probably going to be on the edge and trying to get a stand-up rusher, because right now you don't really know what's happening with Lorenzo Carter and O'Shane Ximenez. You got a really strong first year out of Azeez Ojulari, and I would argue that he is in a really good situation now that Martindale is going to be taking over and leading this defense. But you probably do need somebody to pair across from him, and it benefits the Giants that there are a lot of really good edge rushers. And I would argue that should really be a priority, is finding that guy to play opposite of Ojulari and trying to create pressure that way, so that you don't necessarily need to be reliant on blitzing so much.
Would you say for the edge rushers, because it's so deep, if the Giants were to move on from Lorenzo Carter, it wouldn't be that big of a deal?
Yeah, because the thing with Lorenzo Carter is that we've seen so many injury issues with him, and he hasn't really been entirely on the field. And he looked like he was starting to come along in the final games this year. But do you think that whatever he's offered in free agency, if it's more than what you'd have to pay for a second-round edge rusher or a late first-round edge rusher, wherever they end up drafting somebody, is it really worth paying that extra money when you can get somebody younger that you can develop? This team is probably not going to win right away, so that's probably the better route for them to go. Lorenzo Carter is going to benefit from going somewhere else and getting a fresh start elsewhere. But I would argue that because of how many options they have in this class, you can't pass up on that opportunity to draft somebody. So I would go young if I'm this new front office.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think they're going to, make the playoffs in 2022. I think 2023 is more realistic. Let's talk about the cornerback spot because, James Bradberry has like over a $20 million cap hit. No way are they carrying that. But James Bradberry is still a very good cornerback. So I am of the opinion that maybe they try and trade him before they cut him. Maybe see if Kansas City, for example, might have, an interest in acquiring him because they're going to be facing some really tough wide receivers, including some guys that Bradberry, when he was with the Panthers, regularly defended. So, if that's the case, let's look at Bradberry. Is he a fit for what Wink would do enough to say, you know what, if we can't trade him, let's just keep him, but let's work his number down?
The thing with James Bradberry, and he's worked well in both circumstances that he's been with the Panthers and the Giants, but his his best qualities are working as a zone corner. And what we see from Martindale is that he's very heavy man coverage. Kind of lets his guys work on the outside, and that's worked so well with Marcus Peters and Marlon Humphrey. I would argue, based on all those circumstances that you just laid out, that he's not necessarily what they're probably looking for in terms of scheme, the amount of money that they're going to have to pay him. They're probably going to try and move him and try and replace him with a younger, more athletic man coverage corner. And there's some quality man coverage guys in this class that Derek Stingley could be in play in the top 10. And I'm sure that Martindale's going to be banging the table for him to possibly get him as a replacement. But I think Bradbury, what they're going to have to pay him is just, it's not going to be worth keeping him around.
Do you like Stingley better than Sauce Gardner?
I frankly do. I'm not as high on Sauce Gardner as I think as everybody else is. I mean, he's a PFF darling, which kind of hypes him up a little bit. But I think that you get better traits from Andrew Booth and Derek Stingley. I mean, Sauce Gardner's probably going to be a good pro at the next level, but I just think that there's higher ceiling guys than Gardner out there.
Okay. Now, what about at safety? I know you mentioned Logan Ryan possibly being cut. I'm not so sure they cut Ryan. Maybe they look to redo his number. I don't think he's on this team in 2023 per se. Mm-hmm. But, you cut him. You basically have Julian Love, who's going into his final year of his contract and who's kind of been like, the Johnny on the spot. Wherever you need him, you plug him in. You have Xavier McKinney, who I think is a keeper. Do you think they can get by with Logan Ryan in Wink's system, or do they just, is that not a good fit?
Considering how many other major needs that they have, I feel like right now the safety group it's not good, but it's probably not the most glaring need because, as we mentioned, the offensive line's a major problem. They need to figure out tight end. There's all these other position groups that they need to figure out and address. So that might be the last on the list. So if they go into 2022 with Logan Ryan and the current group that's out there, they'll probably get by. And we were mentioning how we don't think that this next year is a win now situation. So it's, who can you keep around? Maybe you can restructure Logan Ryan, and hopefully he's willing to take that pay cut to stick around. But there are some really good safeties in this class. So maybe if you're picking in the top 10, Kyle Hamilton is a crazy talented player who at 6'4", he's going to be like 215. He's going to run in the 4.4s. He's a crazy athlete. And you'd think that if you're trying to rebuild this defense, get as many really good athletes as possible. He's somebody who's going to be in contention for either of those first-round picks if he's not selected before the Giants can even make that selection. But you also have guys like Jaquan Brisker, I think, that could be in play if he slides into the second round. So you might not have to be forced to go into next season with Logan Ryan. Again, I think at any position, the younger you can get and the cheaper you can get is the best case. Whenever possible, but if you're forced to go out with Logan Ryan, I think that's it's not terrible.
Right. Now, the other guy I want to ask you about, because he's also like in the top 5 of highest cap hits for the Giants, is Blake Martinez. He's coming off the ACL. Before the injury, he was a really good tackler. He made a lot of his tackles within the first 3 yards past the line of scrimmage, which is what you want in a linebacker. Not all tackles, obviously, are considered equal when it comes to linebackers. So next to Blake, I thought Tate Crowder, okay in coverage, but not somebody I think I would want starting next year. Jalen Smith kind of intrigued me a little bit, but I think I need to see a little bit more. Benardrick McKinney, Reggie Ragland, I wouldn't bring back. So do you see them needing to redo that inside linebacker group, or do you think they can get by with Martinez and maybe, somebody they have now, like a Carter Coughlin or a Cam Brown, who I don't know if he's necessarily a fit, or maybe that's not as high of a position of need since, Martindale runs all these sub packages.
Yeah, the one thing that's going to make things super difficult for trying to rework that linebacker group is that the draft class is not very strong at the linebacker position. Like Devin Lloyd from Utah is somebody who gets thrown out there a lot, but it's really not a lot of first-round guys, not a lot of really quality second-round guys. So if you're the Giants, trotting out as many of the current guys that you have out there is probably best for them to do. And I know that Martinez is tricky because he's coming off the ACL. Do you give him the benefit of the doubt and hope that he recovers fully from that, and he doesn't miss a beat. I think out of the group of Gettleman guys that were paid a lot of money in anticipation that this past year was supposed to be a playoff run, I would like to keep Martinez out of any of them. He's been the most consistently productive. He's been a high impact player. He's a veteran. He's a leader, and you want that in the center of your defense. But those remaining holes that you're talking about, they are glaring, and they are a bit of a problem that you don't really have anybody else besides Martinez. It might just have to be who steps up. And right now the depth is pretty weak, but they're probably going to have to roll out there again with a pretty weak linebacker group.
All right, let's talk about the offense. You mentioned tight end. Let's start there. Now, you look at the Buffalo Bills offense where Dable came from. You look at the Kansas City offense where Mike Kafka, the offensive coordinator, came from. Those two teams ranked in the top 8 of using 11 personnel, which is, for those who don't know, 1 running back, 1 tight end. So there's more of an emphasis, I think, on receivers in those two offenses. So that being said, there have been some arguments that the Giants should make an effort to keep Evan Ingram. There are some that feel they should move on from Evan Ingram because there are some that feel, the Giants aren't going to get anybody better than Evan Ingram, especially given that they're not going to take a tight end in the first round. They probably won't take one in the second round. Where do you stand as far as the tight end goes? And, if they do move on from Ingram, and if you think that's the best way to go, whereabouts would you see the Giants maybe dipping into the draft class for that?
Right. Another position group where it's a bit of a problem having to need to fix your tight end group because there's really not many good options. There's not really a first round guy. There's some decent mid round players like Jalen Weidermeyer, Charlie Kohler's name has been brought up a bit, but it's not a very good tight end group. You're not going to get some elite high impact tight end. And you see what Dable had in Buffalo and Shane had in Buffalo with Dawson Knox. That was a mid round guy that they got some good value out of, but he wasn't the biggest receiving threat. He made some really nice plays in the red zone. And, I believe he also threw a touchdown pass. You get some good use out of him, but there is probably going to be a lot more of an emphasis on receiver. Evan Ingram might sadly be their best option, depending on what he's asking for financially. Maybe he's willing to stick around for a cheap deal. I'm willing to keep him if it's maybe like on a 1-year prove it type situation. But don't break the bank for him, which I don't think will happen because there's really, again, same thing with the linebackers. Not a lot of good options for them to fix that situation.
Yeah, definitely. Ingram, I could see maybe doing like a 2-year type of deal, which is actually a 1-year deal. You have avoidable year in there. But the more I look at it, the more I'm thinking he might be back. And I don't think he'll command a lot of, a big contract. I also don't think he's necessarily a fit for Northeast football, but, that's just
a separate issue.
Yeah, that's a separate issue. Exactly. All right. I got to ask you, before I get back to receivers, I got to ask you about the Saquon Barkley debate and where you stand on that. Do you keep him? Do you move him? What do you do with Saquon Barkley?
I'm in the trade or cut camp. Sad. Look, I'm a big Saquon Barkley fan. I was excited when they drafted him, and I was hoping that he would turn into this elite offensive playmaker. And it was kind of like at the very edge of when teams were still using running backs that were high impact superstar type players. And we really only have one guy that fits that mold now, and it's Derrick Henry, and he's starting to show the possibilities of the impacts of getting hit as much as he does. I think Saquon sadly has not shown us as what we've hoped to get. We know that he's a great athlete. It's sometimes difficult when you're that explosive to like use your body without possibly damaging it. Sometimes the human body's not made to move the way that Saquon's able to move it. And that's why he's racking up all these injuries. So move him now before his value is completely gone. You're not going to get a first round pick for him, but anything returnable, if somebody who just wants like a really nice explosive running back that's willing to give him one more shot, if you get like a 3rd round pick for him, I think that's gold. And that might be a little bit optimistic, but you got to get something from him because right now what he's produced and the possibility to start from scratch at that position, I think is the priority. And then not to mention Shane and Dable, where they're coming from. It's a history of just rotating mid to late round guys. And that's probably what's going to happen here in the future.
So is the running back class, if they were to move on from Barkley, do you think they could, I know Shane and Dable, their running backs were a third round pick, and I
Mhm.
think they had an undrafted free agent, if I'm not mistaken. So you're right that, not premium picks. So is this class, and I know running backs come in all different shapes and sizes and flavors, if you will, but can they find what they need and get maybe on a day three, fifth, sixth round and make a go of it?
Yeah, and maybe if you want to, if you get hypothetically, you get a third round draft pick and you want to spend it on somebody in the middle or end of the third round, you got to hope that like someone like Isaiah Spiller, maybe Brees Hall slides a little bit just because of the positional value issues. Keontae Ingram, Kenneth Walker. I'm a big fan of Pierre Strong Jr. from South Dakota State, who I think is going to be a nice rotational type running back. And I think he kind of fits with what they've typically used in Buffalo. He's a bit on the smaller side, but he's explosive. Not crazy fast, but he's pretty shifty. But so like somebody like Pierre Strong, fourth, fifth round, maybe a little bit later than that, you could get a nice steal for getting an FCS guy.
Now, one last point on Saquon, and then I want to talk about offensive line because that's something everybody wants to hear about. Somebody, one of my listeners, suggested, say, hey, might the Giants convert Saquon to a slot receiver since he seems to be so effective out in space and not so much so when you ask him to run
Mm-hmm.
between the tackles. And it's interesting because over at Inside Football, we had a similar idea, and I wanted to bounce that one off you. What you thought about that?
That's an interesting one. That is the first time that I've heard that idea. I'm actually trying to figure out how that would even entirely. I mean, it would work because he's a good receiver, but I just don't know if he's built to be a slot receiver because he's
Yeah,
so wide. Like you'd want him to slim down a little bit. I mean, he's
yeah.
fast, he's shifty, he's a decent route runner. It's a lot to bank on trying to ask him to figure out a completely new position. I would also bet that he's probably wouldn't be entirely committal to that because he's used to playing running back. If he goes out there and he struggles, it kind of defeats the purpose of what he's used to being able to do. So I mean, it's an approach, but I'm not sure if anyone's going to try doing that or not.
Yeah, I agree. But it was something we kicked around because because of the thing, him being good in space and
Yeah.
everything like that. So let's go now with the offensive line here. Now, obviously, other than Andrew Thomas, that whole offensive line probably needs to be redone. So there are different ways to approach this, and I want to get your take on what you think the best way to do this is. Now, I believe you sign an interior offensive lineman that can play all three positions, guard, both guards, and center. All right, so like a James Daniel, who I know is going to probably be expensive if he even hits the market. Now you figure out, okay, are we going to have Gates back? And if you have Gates back, you plug him in at the other guard. Are we going to get Lemieux back? Do you re-sign Billy Price? Do you draft? And if so, where do you draft? And we talked about this, I know, in the first segment, but how do you kind of see that shaping up? How would you approach it in terms of, mixing in free agency and the draft? Because they're going to have to do both, I think.
Yeah, you're going to have to spend some money because there's four positions that you're trying to fix, and you can only spend so many early draft selections. It's tough to get a guy that develops into a quality starter at the offensive line position. More often than not, you see these guys that are high draft selections that end up being quality starters on a lot of rosters. The thing that gets tricky is the center position because there's Tyler Linderbaum and then that's about it. I think that Zion Johnson from Boston College keeps getting floated out there as a possible center, but he's going to be better off at guard, in my opinion. I didn't think he was as good at center from watching what he did at the Senior Bowl, but fix one of the guard spots. I think in the draft is the big priority. Try and address one of that opposite tackle position. If you can come out of the draft after doing that, I think that's a huge upgrade because you've got three young players on that offensive line that are going to develop and grow together, but you're likely going to need to spend some money on a center because Billy Price was not good at all after trading for him. And then I'm very pessimistic about Nick Gates' potential future. I would bet that he's probably not going to be able to come back and contribute very much, just considering the headlines in the news that keeps, like, every so often you kind of hear updates, and it still sounds pretty bleak of a chance that he actually gets to play again. So spending money at center is probably the best situation, and maybe you put Shane Lemieux at the opposite guard, and then you're kind of good to go for That's an improvement to me from what we saw last year. That's a huge step up if you do something like that.
A word about Nick Gates. I said the same thing years ago about Richie Seibert, who had a similar type of injury, and he came back. So, I mean, if anybody can come back from something like this, it's
Right.
Gates. And I don't know necessarily that he's going to be able to come back this year, but I don't know. I'm hoping we haven't seen the last of him because he's just such a tremendous individual and a good player, so well respected, works his butt off. I mean, he's everything you could want on a football team. So I'm pulling for Nick, as I'm sure you are, and as I'm sure a lot of people are. I just don't know if it's going to be this year, but if he does come back, I would put him at guard. I think he's a better guard than maybe center there. Just my take on that. But so I mean, just looking at this, because the offensive line, people say that the offensive line draft class is deep. I'm guessing it's deeper in certain positions than in others. Interior, would you say, or tackle, or
Yeah,
where would you say the deep?
it's pretty strong at tackle and at guard. The bigger issue, like I mentioned, is there's really not a lot of options at center. There were a lot of quality centers that decided to go back to school, so that really leaned out the class. So if they want to draft a guard on day two, they could very well get some pretty good value out of that. But tackle, guard are probably the stronger offensive line position groups in this year's draft.
Yeah. All right. Couple more positions I want to talk about. Obviously, we got to talk about receiver, and we're going to have to talk about quarterback. So let's touch on receiver. I'm going to save quarterback for last because that's going to be a debatable one. Receiver. I think the Giants move on from Sterling Shepard, which is going to kill me because I love Sterling Shepard, but he's coming off the late season injury. Kind of when they took Kadarius Toney, I suspected that was the handwriting on the wall. Kenny Golladay, they're kind of stuck with, even though he didn't do very well last year. Darius Slayton, I don't think Darius Slayton has a long-term future with this team. So to me, I suspect that receiver group has to be redone as well. Do you see it the same way? And who are some of the names that you think might be fits for the Giants in this year's draft class?
Very similar to what we were talking about with the safety group. I think that it could end up being them needing to address more important position groups first, but they're probably going to try and draft or sign somebody. Galladay, you kind of have to give him a second chance because of all the money that they're tied to him now. Tony, I mean, he looked good. He showed some flashes, but I think drafting when you get towards the second round, there's some interesting options. I think somebody like Christian Watson from North Dakota State looked really good. There's the difficult thing is that if the Giants were picking a little bit later in the first round, I think it would be a little bit more exciting and hoping that maybe you can get like a Jameson Williams, who's a really good athlete, or like a Chris Olave. But kind of hoping that maybe some of those guys slide. Maybe you can draft them in the top of the second round. But I think Christian Watson is a really interesting name because you're going to want to address some of those other position groups early, and then somebody like Watson is going to be available on day two.
Okay. So, your gut feeling is they maybe roll with Kadarius Toney, Darius Slayton, Kenny Golladay, and then just kind of fill out receiver 4 and 5, and if they keep 6.
Yeah, and I just think that with all those other position groups that they need to fix, they've got decent options. It's not a really explosive group. And what you've had in Buffalo, you have Stephon Diggs, who's a really good receiver, but the rest of the group is, they're decent. Gabriel Davis is a decent receiver. Nobody that's like an elite high production receiver that's opposite of Diggs. So you don't really necessarily need to go and draft like an elite first round guy. I think that working in the depth of that group is probably going to be the priority, and then maybe hoping in the following draft class or in the following free agency that you can find somebody to work alongside Kenny Golladay, or that Kenny Golladay steps up. But the situation of this roster, I think receiver probably gets pushed down the priority list.
Okay, now we got to talk about Daniel Jones. I saved this one for last. Daniel, I've always said, the Giants have screwed him over. And I'm glad that John Mara came out and said, look, we've done everything possible to destroy this kid. They didn't have a good offensive line in for him. They didn't have stability in the coaching ranks. They didn't have, they just didn't set up. And I always equated to, bringing home a newborn baby and not having everything you need to fit that baby into your household. That said, there were things that Daniel maybe didn't take steps in, the decision making, coming off of his first read, some of his, his internal clock, not feeling the pressure and dagnammit running and not sliding, which drove me crazy. I can't tell you how many times I kept saying he's going to get dinged and he's going to miss time, and sure enough, he did. So let's start there, Joe. When you look at Daniel Jones, where do you see him having taken a step from year 2 to year 3? And where did he most disappoint, in your opinion? Where should he have taken that step that he didn't?
I don't know if I can actually pinpoint a step that he took from year 2 to year 3, because the bigger thing is the disappointment and the lack of taking that step in his decision making. We were hoping that from 1 to 2 he was going to really improve his decision making, and then 2 to 3 is kind of where things start to take off. And it's really confusing because this is a really smart kid. He went to Duke. I believe he held an offer from Princeton. But you would think somebody with that mental capability that they would be able to make really good decisions on the field. They'd be able to read things in front of him. But it just, every time you watch him make a mistake, it's like, what were you thinking there? And I think he was significantly hamstrung by the horrible, outdated offense that Jason Garrett had him running. So it's tough for me to really fully critically evaluate him. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt for this, what's probably going to be his last chance to prove himself. But that decision-making thing for me is a big issue, and I'm hoping that Brian Daboll can maybe simplify things, because he worked with a guy in Josh Allen who decision-making and accuracy was a problem for him. And look at the development that he's had. So hopefully Kafka, Daboll can maybe unlock something, but hopefully that something is not just being average.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Daniel Jones was in year 2 of Garrett's offense and didn't still look like he was, feeling his way around, that
Right.
bothered me. Like I said, not playing smart when he exposed himself as a runner, that bothered me. And, he is a smart kid. He's a hardworking kid, but I did not understand why we didn't see more progress there with the decision making, with speeding things up. I suspected sometimes some of his passes were coming out late, and that was ruining the timing with the receivers. I just didn't get it. And P.S. If I'm the Giants, I do not exercise his option year this year.
Yeah.
I don't see any advantage to doing it. So with that said, okay, so the Giants, we know that Mike Lennon isn't the answer. They brought down Davis Webb from Buffalo. They have the other kid from Buffalo, Jake Fromm. But I'm not sure if either of those are the answers. So if you're looking in terms of a backup quarterback, I know some people keep asking me, well, what if they draft Malik Willis or this guy or that guy? I wouldn't draft a quarterback this year at all. Maybe if you pick one up as an undrafted free agent or something like that. But it's clear to me they have to go the veteran route. So that said, who out there would you go for that you think would be a good fit? Because they're going to need somebody who, if Daniel Jones gets injured, and history would suggest that he will get injured again, you're going to want somebody who can step in with a decent record, who you're not going to have a major drop-off with. Who's that guy?
Just trying to think of some of the guys that might be available in this upcoming free agency group.
Like, I know Marcus Mariota, right. Jacoby Brissett.
Right, and
Teddy
Jameis Winston. Yeah, Teddy's going to be not worth the money. Yeah, so Trubisky, that one I think is a little bit interesting, and I would argue that the idea here should not be bringing in somebody to just step in when Daniel Jones gets hurt, but maybe to light a little fire underneath him and motivate him. So somebody like Trubisky or Mariota, I think those two guys, they're not like way over the age of 30. They're not like super dinosaur guys, but they're former first rounders that are quality guys that have been starters at one point and have the traits to possibly succeed. I would give you a guy like that an opportunity. You could have like a Tannehill type situation when Tannehill came in and beat out Marcus Mariota. So I would rather have competition than just a backup in this situation, because then that can help you really figure out what the direction is going to be in 2023. Do you then draft somebody? Do you go and trade for a big name quarterback to then lead the team, instead of just saying, Daniel Jones, go do whatever you want, and then we're going to have another horrible backup like Mike Glennon that's just going to kind of sit there behind you. But if they can go and get somebody like Trubisky, I don't think any team is going to be trying to go sign him as their starter. So I think Trubisky, Mariota, I think those all could be great options to just provide some competition for Daniel Jones.
Yeah, I like that approach too. And also, as I said, if Daniel Jones does win the job this year and he doesn't take the step, now you can say, okay, after this year, you can say, okay, Daniel, nice knowing you. And you have a veteran. If you sign this veteran to a 2-year deal and you want to draft a young kid, now you've got somebody who can
Right.
mentor and keep the seat warm, so to speak. So it kind of works out, I think, if they go that route. But they are going to have to definitely spend on a backup quarterback. That was one of the areas last year. You know, you talk about bad cap management. They cut corners on that, and I know why they went for Glennon, because he had the stronger arm, but I questioned the choice, because there had to be other guys with stronger arms that were a little bit more successful with their one-loss record.
Yeah, I was never a fan of the Glennon decision because the guy has never been successful anywhere he is. Just, the big arm thing is like, okay, that's great. It's kind of like having a fast receiver who can't catch. It's nice to have and it's nice to say that you have, but if he can't do anything when you need him to produce, it's kind of useless. But I think that some level of competition is probably going to be the plan here for a completely new regime. And I still stand by. I completely forgot that Trubisky was in this group, but the more that I keep thinking about it, I think Trubisky makes the most sense considering that Dayball and Shane have that connection to him.
Yeah, I'm thinking Mariota myself, but certainly, along those lines, guys that have, an accomplished record and whatnot. But Trubisky might be a little too expensive, but who knows? I mean, they might be able to work out a hometown discount since everybody's
Right.
moving down to Jersey. All right, before I let you go, Joe, on the draft, the combine starting next week, the position groups that you think will have Giant fans most excited? I know you mentioned the edge rushers, but what are some of the other groups that you think are going to really, reveal some names that Giant fans can be excited about?
I think the corner group is really going to separate themselves because there's a lot of different types and styles of corners in this year's class, and certain guys are going to really, really flash physically, especially with like their 40 time, their jumps and all that stuff. Certain players that we maybe were aware of but haven't been entirely talking about a ton, I think are going to really play themselves into the conversation more. That could be in that situation for the Giants to draft them somewhere on day 2. But this corner group, super underrated. There's a lot of really good athletes, and there's going to be some names that pop and start to build up some steam.
All right. It's going to be interesting. The combine, looks like they're going to have it close as possible to what it used to be before we had this pandemic. So certainly a lot of stuff to keep an eye on. And I guess it would be a good idea not to caution everybody. Don't fall in love with a guy's measurables because that only tells you so much about what a
Right.
guy can actually do. I know a lot of people do fall in love with those measurables, but there's a reason why they call it the Underwear Olympics. So.
Yeah, you gotta take it with a grain of salt. The numbers that you get from the combine are supposed to affirm any evaluations that you've made on film. They're not supposed to be the reason you draft a guy. That's how you get Darius Hayward-Bay getting drafted as high that he did by the Raiders a while back. But don't oversell. Don't get overly excited. Be excited when Kyle Hamilton runs a 4.4 at 6'4" and 215 pounds, or when Christian Watson runs a 4.4 at the same size. Be excited when you see that happen. The guys that we know are supposed to move fast, not when somebody who's a nobody who has a really good day and think that he's suddenly a first rounder.
Yeah, sort of like John Ross a few years ago,
Right.
right? Exactly.
Right.
All right, Joe, great stuff as always. Again, folks, you can find him at the BLEAV podcast. He is the host of the NFL Draft Prospects podcast. Again, that's the BLEAV network. You see his Twitter handle below if you want to follow him on Twitter. Appreciate you tuning in. Joe, thank you for the great information. And this Joe's first time appearance on this podcast, so I was happy to have him come on. Giant fans, we're going to have Emery Hunt still to come on the podcast. That show's going to be, I'm going to tape it late Friday, so that show will probably run Saturday. So that's the plan there. And then next week, it's combine time. We're going to finally have some news, hopefully. So make sure you tune it in here at the Locked On Giants podcast. For Joe DeLeone, I'm Patricia Traina. Everybody, we'll talk to you again later this week.